Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories.
In February 1989, the last Soviet armored columns rolled across the Friendship Bridge and out of Afghanistan. Television cameras captured tanks disappearing into the distance, soldiers returning home, and a weary superpower bringing an exhausting decade-long war to an end. Behind those images lay a staggering cost. More than 15,000 Soviet soldiers had died. For a society that had spent decades projecting strength and inevitability, the losses left a deep scar. At the time, many analysts called Afghanistan the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The war consumed lives, money, and political capital while producing increasingly uncertain results. Coffins returned home to towns and cities across the USSR, and public faith in the system slowly eroded. While Afghanistan did not single-handedly destroy the Soviet Union, it became one of the symbols of a state that was exhausting itself in pursuit of a goal it could not fully achieve. Now fast forward nearly 4 decades. The numbers that once shocked Soviet society have begun to look almost small by comparison. According to recent estimates, Russia is now losing more soldiers in Ukraine during a single month than the Soviet Union lost during the entire 10-year Afghan war. What once represented a national trauma has been surpassed many times over. The scale is difficult to comprehend. While exact figures remain known only to the Kremlin, multiple independent analyses suggest that by the end of 2025, Russian military fatalities may have exceeded 350,000. That figure does not include many foreign volunteers, mercenaries, or fighters from the self-proclaimed republics in eastern Ukraine. It refers only to a portion of the dead. To put that into perspective, 350,000 deaths would be more than 20 times the Soviet losses suffered in Afghanistan. It would represent one of the bloodiest military experiences endured by a major power since the end of the Second World War. For many observers, the question is no longer whether Russia is paying a heavy price for this war. The question is whether any state can continue paying such a price indefinitely. And that question becomes even more urgent when we examine what those losses have actually achieved on the battlefield. According to recent reporting, Vladimir Putin remains intensely focused on one objective above all others: capturing the remainder of the Donbass. Officials close to the Kremlin have reportedly suggested that Russia's military leadership convinced him this goal could be achieved within a relatively short time frame. The problem is that the battlefield itself appears to be telling a different story. For much of 2026, Russian forces have continued to advance, but the pace has been painfully slow. By some estimates using data compiled from battlefield mapping projects, Russian troops have captured only a few hundred square kilometers of territory, while Ukrainian forces have simultaneously retaken portions of lost ground. On a map, these changes can appear significant. On the ground, they often amount to villages, tree lines, and fields that have changed hands at enormous cost. The numbers become even more striking when casualty estimates are introduced. One analysis suggested that hundreds of Russian soldiers were killed or seriously wounded for every square kilometer of territory seized in parts of the Donbass. Entire assaults have been launched to capture positions that can be crossed on foot in minutes. The human cost of each advance has become increasingly difficult to justify through military logic alone. American officials have also highlighted the scale of the losses. Secretary of State Marco Rubio remarked that Russia was losing between 15 and 20,000 soldiers a month killed, not wounded, but dead. Whether one accepts the upper or lower end of that estimate, the conclusion remains the same. The rate of attrition is extraordinary. Yet wars are rarely measured only by territory gained. History is filled with offensives that initially appeared wasteful, but later achieved strategic breakthroughs. That reality forces analysts to ask an important question. Are Russia's losses the sign of an offensive running out of momentum, or merely the price of a campaign that has not yet reached its decisive moment? It is tempting to look at a battlefield map and assume it tells the entire story. A few kilometers gained here, a few kilometers lost there, and the outcome seems obvious, but military history repeatedly warns against that kind of thinking. Territory can be a useful indicator, yet it is often one of the most misleading measures of success. Consider the German Spring Offensive of 1918. In its opening stages, German forces achieved some of the largest advances seen on the Western Front in years. Entire sections of Allied territory were overrun, and for a moment it appeared as though Germany had finally broken the deadlock. Yet those gains came at a devastating cost. By the time the offensive stalled, Germany had exhausted many of its best troops and weakened itself fatally for the battles that followed. The point is not that Ukraine today resembles the Western Front of 1918. Rather, it is that battlefield momentum cannot be measured solely by the amount of land captured. An army can advance and still be weakening, another can retreat and still be improving its long-term position. The relationship between territory and victory is rarely straightforward. This is especially important when evaluating Russia's current offensive operations. The slow pace of advances may suggest diminishing effectiveness, but there are also reasons to be cautious about drawing firm conclusions. As spring turns into summer, vegetation thickens across much of eastern Ukraine. Trees, crops, and dense foliage make it harder for drone operators to detect movement, potentially creating opportunities for attacking forces that did not exist during the winter months. Military conditions are constantly evolving. A front line that appears frozen today may become more fluid tomorrow. Russian commanders undoubtedly hope that seasonal changes, battlefield adaptation, or technological improvements can generate greater momentum in the months ahead. Yet even if the pace of advances accelerates somewhat, another problem remains. Territory can be recovered, equipment can be replaced, human lives are far harder to regenerate, and it is in the casualty figures that the most dramatic shift in this war may now be occurring. For much of the war, discussions about casualties followed a familiar pattern. Ukraine, with a smaller population and fewer available manpower reserves, was generally assumed to be under greater long-term demographic pressure. Every loss seemed more costly because Kiev had fewer people to replace those who fell. Russia, by contrast, could rely on a much larger population and appeared better positioned to absorb attrition. But over the last year, that picture has begun to change. Not because Ukraine has stopped suffering losses, it has not, but because the trajectory of casualties appears to be moving in opposite directions for the two armies. While Russian losses continue to climb, Ukrainian losses seem to have stabilized or slowed compared to the most catastrophic periods of the war. Several analyses suggest that Russia may now be losing around 1,000 personnel a day when killed, wounded, and captured are combined. No single estimate is perfect, and all wartime statistics should be treated with caution. Yet across multiple studies, one trend appears repeatedly. Russian casualty rates have risen sharply as offensive operations have intensified. For Ukraine, the pattern has been different. The opening months of the invasion and the failed counteroffensive of 2023 were among the most costly periods of the conflict. Since then, Kiev has increasingly shifted toward a defensive strategy centered on fortifications, drones, and long-range strikes designed to inflict losses while conserving manpower. The demographic implications are still severe for both sides. Some estimates suggest that roughly 1 in 25 Russian men between the ages of 18 and 49 has been killed or wounded during the war. For Ukraine, the ratio may be even higher, reflecting the country's smaller population. Yet statistics alone do not tell the full story. What matters is direction. And the direction is what has captured the attention of military analysts. One army appears to be suffering accelerating losses while attacking. The other appears to be reducing losses while defending. That reversal raises an uncomfortable possibility for Moscow that the battlefield is becoming deadlier precisely for the side trying hardest to advance. For decades, modern warfare followed a rough pattern. Improvements in battlefield medicine, rapid evacuation systems, and advanced trauma care meant that wounded soldiers were increasingly likely to survive. Military planners often worked from a general rule of thumb. For every soldier killed, roughly 3 others would be wounded. In some highly advanced militaries, the ratio was even more favorable. During recent American conflicts, the number of wounded often greatly exceeded the number of dead because helicopters, armored ambulances, and field hospitals could move casualties to treatment quickly. A soldier who might have died in an earlier war could now survive. That is what makes recent reports from Ukraine so alarming. According to estimates cited by Ukrainian intelligence, Russian forces may now be experiencing the opposite pattern. Instead of 3 wounded for every dead soldier, the ratio appears to have inverted. In some sectors, there may be more deaths than survivable wounds. If accurate, this would represent one of the most lethal casualty patterns seen in modern warfare. Naturally, skepticism is warranted. Wartime claims should never be accepted uncritically, particularly when they originate from one side of a conflict. Yet even analysts who question the exact figures acknowledge that something unusual may be happening on the battlefield. The reason is not necessarily larger bombs or more artillery. In many ways, the modern battlefield has become deadlier because it is harder to escape it. A wounded soldier's survival often depends not on the severity of the initial injury, but on how quickly they can be evacuated and treated. And in Ukraine, evacuation itself is increasingly becoming one of the most dangerous missions imaginable. To understand why the wounded may now be dying in such extraordinary numbers, we have to look at the weapon that has transformed this war more than any other, the FPV drone. In the early months of the war, artillery remained the undisputed king of the battlefield. Soldiers feared shell fire, commanders worried about ammunition stocks, and entire operations were planned around the range of guns. 4 years later, that battlefield looks very different. Today, one of the greatest threats often comes from a machine small enough to fit into a backpack. First-person view drones, commonly known as FPV drones, have transformed the front lines into a constantly monitored kill zone. Equipped with cameras and explosives, these inexpensive devices allow operators sitting miles away to hunt individual soldiers, vehicles, and supply teams with extraordinary precision. What was once a relatively safe journey behind the front has become a dangerous expedition through drone-infested airspace. In some sectors, soldiers approaching the front line may spend the final 5, 10, or even 25 kilometers under the constant threat of drone surveillance. Every movement risks detection: a vehicle moving down a dirt road, a group of soldiers crossing an open field, even an ambulance attempting to evacuate the wounded can become a target. This is where casualty statistics begin to make more sense. Historically, a wounded soldier's best chance of survival came from rapid evacuation. Medics stabilized the casualty, vehicles transported them to treatment, and modern medicine did the rest. But when evacuation routes themselves are under constant drone attack, every step in that chain becomes vulnerable. Military analyst Philip O'Brien has argued that the reported inversion of the killed-to-wounded ratio is entirely plausible for this reason. A soldier who might once have reached a hospital within an hour may now remain stranded for hours in a trench, a crater, or a damaged vehicle. The injury that would previously have been survivable slowly becomes fatal. Ukraine faces this problem as well, but not always to the same degree. As the defending force, it often operates from more prepared positions. It has also invested heavily in innovations such as unmanned ground vehicles capable of evacuating casualties without exposing additional soldiers to drone attacks. Even so, both sides are confronting a battlefield unlike anything seen in previous generations of warfare. The result is grim. Drones have not merely changed how soldiers fight. They may be changing the fundamental mathematics of survival itself. Drones alone do not explain Russia's mounting losses. They are only one layer of a much larger defensive system that Ukraine has spent years constructing. After repeated criticism over weak fortifications in parts of the front, Kiev appears to have finally transformed many sectors into defensive networks specifically designed to bleed attacking forces. Military analysts describe stretches of the Eastern Front where multiple defensive lines now exist behind the primary positions. Trenches, anti-vehicle obstacles, fortified firing points, and extensive belts of barbed wire create a layered battlefield that attackers must cross under constant observation. Even reaching the first defensive line can be a deadly undertaking. There is a certain historical irony here. In 2023, it was Ukrainian troops who found themselves struggling against Russia's heavily fortified Surovikin line during the failed counteroffensive. Progress was agonizingly slow. Minefields, trenches, and artillery combined to turn relatively short advances into costly operations. Today, in many sectors, Russian troops are experiencing a remarkably similar problem. The difference is that the battlefield has evolved. The soldiers attacking Ukrainian defenses are not only confronting trenches and obstacles, they are also being watched from above by FPV drones, reconnaissance drones, and strike drones capable of attacking vehicles or individual troops with alarming accuracy. Every movement is exposed. Every mistake is punished quickly. For Russian assault groups, this often means advancing through open terrain, navigating layers of wire and fortifications, and doing so while under constant threat from both traditional firepower and unmanned systems. Even when a position is eventually captured, the price paid can be disproportionate to its military value. This combination of modern drones and old-fashioned fortifications has created something unusual, a battlefield that feels simultaneously futuristic and deeply familiar. The technology is new, but the underlying reality is not. Armies are once again finding themselves trapped in a brutal contest of attrition, paying enormous costs for relatively small gains. For much of the war, Russia's greatest advantage was not technology, artillery, or even territory. It was manpower. The Kremlin could absorb losses on a scale that would be politically and militarily devastating for many other countries. Month after month, new recruits, volunteers, contract soldiers, and mobilized personnel flowed into the ranks, allowing offensive operations to continue despite staggering casualties. But manpower advantages only matter if replacements arrive faster than losses occur, and increasingly there are signs that this equation may be shifting. After years of relying on generous signing bonuses and regional recruitment campaigns, the flow of new recruits appears to be slowing. Recent estimates suggest that Russia may now be bringing in somewhere between 24 and 30,000 new personnel per month. On paper, those numbers are still substantial. Yet at the same time, total monthly losses, including killed, wounded, and captured, are often estimated at around 35,000 or more. If those figures are even approximately correct, they point toward a troubling trend for Moscow. The army would be losing manpower faster than it can replenish it. Not catastrophically, not overnight, but steadily. A gap that small might seem manageable at first. Over months and years, however, it compounds. This is precisely the dynamic Ukraine hopes to exploit. Rather than seeking dramatic breakthroughs across the front, Kiev's strategy increasingly focuses on attrition, destroying personnel and equipment at a rate that exceeds Russia's ability to replace them. Every drone strike, every artillery barrage, every failed assault contributes to that larger objective. Complicating matters further is the political question hanging over the Kremlin. A second large-scale mobilization could potentially solve some manpower shortages, but it would also carry serious domestic risks. Mobilization was deeply unpopular when first introduced, and there are strong reasons to believe Putin would prefer to avoid repeating the experience unless absolutely necessary. For now, Russia continues to find new soldiers. The question is whether it can keep finding enough of them. And answering that question requires understanding just how many soldiers Russia may already have lost. One of the greatest challenges in analyzing this war is that nobody outside the Kremlin knows the true number of Russian casualties. Moscow has released official figures only sparingly, and even those numbers were widely dismissed as unrealistically low. As a result, researchers have been forced to rely on alternative methods to estimate the human cost of the conflict. One of the most respected efforts is the joint project conducted by the independent Russian outlet Mediazona and the BBC Russian service. Their approach is remarkably simple. Rather than estimating deaths through battlefield reports, they identify individual soldiers whose deaths can be confirmed through obituaries, grave photographs, regional announcements, and public records. The result is what has become known as the names list. Every entry represents a real person whose death can be independently verified. No statistical modeling, no assumptions, just confirmed cases. At the time of reporting, that list had surpassed 217,000 Russian military deaths. That figure alone is astonishing. More than 217,000 confirmed dead would already make this one of the deadliest military experiences suffered by a major power since World War II. Yet almost everyone involved in the project agrees that the number represents a minimum baseline rather than a final total. To estimate the true scale of losses, Mediazona and Medusa developed a second project using Russia's inheritance registry system. By comparing known military deaths with probate records and demographic data, they created statistical models designed to estimate how many deaths likely remain unrecorded in public reporting. Their conclusion was startling. By the end of 2025, they estimated that approximately 352,000 Russian soldiers may have died in the war. That figure excludes many foreign fighters, troops from the self-proclaimed republics, and much of the subsequent fighting in 2026. In other words, even this estimate may not represent the final total. Whether the true number is somewhat lower or substantially higher, the broader conclusion remains difficult to escape. Russia has suffered losses on a scale almost unimaginable in a modern conflict. The question is no longer whether those losses are severe. The question is what Russia has achieved in exchange for them. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, many observers expected Ukraine to collapse within weeks. There were predictions that Kiev would fall quickly, that the government would flee, and that Moscow would impose a new political reality before the world could react. 4 years later, none of those things have happened. Russia still controls significant portions of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea and large sections of the east and south. But many of the Kremlin's original objectives remain unfulfilled. Parts of the Donbass are still contested. The government in Kiev remains in power. NATO has not retreated from Eastern Europe. It has expanded. And Russia finds itself increasingly dependent on China economically and diplomatically. This is where the casualty figures become so politically and strategically important. Throughout history, societies have accepted enormous sacrifices when those sacrifices produced visible results. The Soviet Union endured unimaginable losses during the Second World War because those losses ultimately contributed to defeating Nazi Germany. The challenge for Moscow today is that the relationship between sacrifice and achievement appears far less clear. That does not mean Russia is on the verge of collapse. Wars rarely follow neat narratives. It is entirely possible that improved weather, tactical adaptation, or technological innovation could allow Russian forces to make additional gains. Likewise, Ukraine faces serious problems of its own: manpower shortages, recruitment difficulties, internal frustrations, and the constant pressure of sustaining a long war. The future remains uncertain. Perhaps Russia's offensive will regain momentum. Perhaps casualty rates and recruitment shortfalls will gradually drain its ability to continue large-scale attacks. Perhaps political circumstances inside Russia will change. Or perhaps the war will simply continue grinding forward, consuming lives while producing little movement. What can be said with confidence is that the current trajectory is troubling for the Kremlin. Russia entered this war with a substantial manpower advantage and has spent years converting that advantage into casualties at a staggering rate. Authoritarian systems can absorb hardship. They can absorb failure. They can even absorb extraordinary human losses. But history suggests that no society can absorb them forever. In 1989, the Soviet Union emerged from Afghanistan carrying the weight of 15,000 dead. At the time, that burden seemed immense. Today, Russia's losses in Ukraine may be more than 20 times greater. Whether those losses eventually prove politically sustainable remains one of the most important unanswered questions of the war. For now, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The battlefield is changing, the casualty equation is changing, and unless Moscow finds a way to reverse those trends, the growing number of coffins returning home may eventually become as dangerous to Russia's future as any Ukrainian weapon.